Hello everyone, thank you so much for your patience. My name is Ranger Jamie. I'm here with Ranger Ann and Ranger Eliza and the wonderful Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society and all of you fine people. Thank you so much for coming today. Just a reminder, we've got the Coast Guard Auxiliary present with us today, so please stop in and say hello to them. Of course, Mr. Hamilton is the father of the Coast Guard, right? So a round of applause for the Coast Guard. And I'm a Coast Guard vet, so it's a special welcome. The following talk will share insights on Alexander Hamilton's early life in the Caribbean through the examination of a letter that 12-year-old Hamilton wrote to his friend Edward Stevens. The letter, written 250 years ago, is the oldest letter written by Hamilton and contains fascinating pronouncements of his later life. This talk is presented by Nicole Scholet de Villavicencio, the co-founder of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, and a historian specializing in the founding era of the United States. She has spoken on the lives of Alexander and Eliza Hamilton at venues such as Hamilton Grange National Memorial, the Schuyler Mansion, and George Washington University Museum, and has been featured on C-SPAN. A warm welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here as a part of the belated Happy Birthday Hamilton. We weren't able to host our planned program January 12th since the site was closed, so glad that you all came back out today to celebrate Hamilton anyways. So this talk is exploring Hamilton's earliest letter. And this year is the 250th anniversary of him writing that letter. So we really wanted to focus on what exactly he wrote and why he wrote it. And this letter is interesting not just because it's the oldest known, the oldest extant letter, but because of what he said in it. It's really fascinating to look back and see what 12-year-old Hamilton was thinking and how his dreams came true later on. And I am a leader of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society who's co-hosting today's program along with Hamilton Grange. So here's the letter in all its glory, and I will show you different snippets of it. But I'm sure the first thing that you could admire that as a 12-year-old boy, he had quite impressive handwriting. Very neat, and if you have a chance to sign Alexander Hamilton's birthday card out in the front with a quill and ink, I'm sure you'll get more of an appreciation for how even his lines are. He has a very florid signature. There's his signature there, yours, Alex Hamilton. And here you can just see it was written on St. Croix on November 11th, Veterans Day today, 1769, which is interesting when you will hear how he concluded this letter. And here you can see Dear Edward, that's his friend that he's writing to. And I just wanted to give a little shout out to Eliza Hamilton. It was thanks to her that this letter was preserved. And although this is a little blurry, it says the Library of Congress. And it was thanks to her that it was now a part of the Library of Congress today. So Edward Stevens and Alexander Hamilton, Creoles from the Caribbean. Creole meant that you were of European descent, but you were born in the Caribbean. So here's just the overall map of the Caribbean. And this is the specific area that they were from. So Edward Stevens was born on February 21st, 1754 on Antigua. Alexander Hamilton was born on January 11th, happy birthday Hamilton, on Nevis. And I don't know, there's not a lot of information on when the Stevens family moved over to St. Croix, but we do know that Alexander Hamilton moved over and his family moved over in 1765. So Alexander Hamilton on St. Croix. 1766, Beekman and Kruger came down from New York and established a mercantile firm on St. Croix, and shortly thereafter hired Alexander Hamilton. 2 years later, in 1768, Rachel, Hamilton's mother, dies, and by this point, the elder James Hamilton, the father, had already left the family, was living on a different Caribbean island, likely for work, but he did not return. And so Alexander and James, his brother, James Jr., go to live with Peter Lytton, a cousin. Well, just the next year, the cousin commits suicide on July 12th, and just less than a month later, the uncle, James Lytton, dies. And so they're left without any family that can take care of them on St. Croix. So they're taken in by the Stevens family. Now, Alexander Hamilton was already good friends with Edward Stevens at this point. In fact, research by Michael Newton shows that at the time that Alexander Hamilton and his brother were being taken in by the Stevens family, Edward Stevens was on his way to New York City. So this, just as a disclaimer, some say is a picture of young Hamilton. It's not sure if that actually is, but at least to give you a sense. And Timothy Pickering, who later in life was a good friend of Alexander Hamilton's, he, in 1822, wrote down a recollection of the first time that he met Edward Stevens. I was struck by the extraordinary similitude of his and General Hamilton's faces. I thought they must be brothers. Today, Mr. Yard, who was Edward Stevens' brother-in-law, informed me that the remark had been made 1,000 times. So they looked very similar, and they were now both in the same house. So Edward Stevens moves to New York City around the same time that the Hamilton boys are moving in with the family. And this here is a picture of the Ratzer plan, which was made in 1769. So you can see what New York City was like at the time. And by November 11th, Alexander had received 2 letters from Edward Stevens. So now we're finally getting to the letter, his reply to Stevens. So I'm going to read through this letter, or at least a section of the letter, and then we'll go back and discuss it, translate it into 21st century speak, if you will. As to what you say respecting your having soon the happiness of seeing us all, I wish for an accomplishment of your hopes, provided they are concomitant with your welfare, otherwise not, though doubt whether I shall be present or not. To confess my weakness, Ned, my ambition is prevalent, that I contemn the groveling and condition of a clerk or the like, to which my fortune, etc., condemns me. I would willingly risk my life, though not my character, to exalt my station. I'm confident, Ned, that my youth excludes me from any hopes of immediate preferment, nor do I desire it, but I mean to prepare the way for futurity. I'm no philosopher, you see, and may be justly said to build castles in the air. My folly makes me ashamed, and beg you'll conceal it. Yet, Nettie, we have seen such schemes successful when the projector is constant. I shall conclude saying I wish there was a war. So what is he saying? What does all this mean? So Edward, in his letters, must have implied that maybe he would be coming back to St. Croix. And Hamilton is basically saying, well, I hope you don't, because you're in New York City and I hope you're pursuing your dreams. And he had a PS to this letter, I'm glad you're doing a hard job studying. So Hamilton, you can already see his focus on education. And Hamilton alludes to the fact that he might not be in St. Croix when Stevens comes back. Why is that? So he says that he is ambition. Now, ambition in the 18th century was almost a negative word. It implied that you were really power hungry and looking out for yourself. And there's a great quote by Washington saying, yes, Hamilton's ambitious, but it's of the laudable kind. He wants to elevate himself. But he says that he basically hates his current job. He no longer has a family member to support him. He's been working for a few years now, since he was a young boy, at a mercantile firm, and he has no other fortune or any other way to advance at life, especially in 18th century Caribbean culture, from his current stand. Nothing really on the horizon that he can really improve himself with. He's stuck being a clerk, and as he says, to which his fortune condemns him. He says he would willingly risk his life, though not his character, to improve his current lot in life. And he understands that there's probably no chance of any change in that at this time, and he doesn't wish for it yet, but he's making plans for the future. He wants to see where he can go. And build castles in the air, meant to create dreams or hopes or plans that are very unrealistic. And you can see here his actual handwriting of these individual sections. And this is very interesting. We have seen such schemes successful when the projector is constant. Well, obviously they didn't have projectors like this in the 18th century, but projectors actually were a very common, it was a person that was around in the 18th century, especially in the colonial time, and they were basically people, very individuals that would make propositions to the government to create projects and oversee them independently. And so this is from an article called The Age of the Projectors. Successful projectors had to link their proposals to the existing concerns of particular influential interests in order to win and retain ministry approval. The projector was very much on his own. And it was all about personal advancement. How can they get involved and advance personally? And they had to create feasible projects, and it's little wonder that their success rate was so low. So here Hamilton is saying that, you know, we see all these projectors maybe come to the island with these plans, and they're often not successful, but those that stick to their task, that are determined to see out their plan, those are the ones that are successful, and that's what I want to be. I shall conclude saying I wish there was a war. There was no other real opportunity in 18th century life to get ahead unless you gained military valor and a military reputation on the battlefield. So he knew that he had to seek out that opportunity, and that was his only way to really improve his lot in life. So, did Hamilton get his wish? Spoiler alert, yes. So, there's a lot of ways that I could go on with this presentation, talk to you about all his accomplishments, but I thought it would be really interesting to continue looking at that lens of his relationship, his friendship with Edward Stevens, and how Hamilton's dreams came true through the different periods of his life that he was reunited with Edward Stevens. So first, they were reunited at King's College. That's where Edward Stevens had gone to college in New York City. Hamilton joined him there in 1773. And they joined with a few friends to form, quote, a weekly club for our improvement in composition, in debating, and in public speaking. Fun fact, this was just an informal group, but in 1802, the Philalexian Society was established by Alexander Hamilton's son and other members. And today that society is not only the oldest student group at Columbia, but it's one of the oldest college literary and debate societies in the US. So again, Hamilton has made it to the mainland, he's pursuing his education, and he's relying on his friendship with Edward Stevens and others that he meets to improve himself. And they both studied together for 1 year before Edward Stevens graduated in 1774. So after King's College, they went their separate ways. Edward Stevens returned to St. Croix for a year, and interestingly, he had graduated with a Bachelor of Arts, but he then went to Edinburgh, the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, to study medicine a year later. This here is a picture of Scotland at the time of Edinburgh. And in 1775, he earned his doctorate of medicine. Now Hamilton, remember he said, I wish there was a war. He got his wish. So less than 6 years later, he ended up having to leave King's College to fight in the Revolutionary War. He was commissioned as a captain of the New York Artillery, and he, 2 years later, attracted so much attention that he became aide-de-camp, or a personal secretary to General George Washington. And there's another letter that was preserved from Edward Stevens living in Edinburgh to Alexander Hamilton, saying, I congratulate you, my dear friend, on the late successes of the United States against their tyrannical adversaries. Why have you not written me a single line since our separation? Has your anxiety for public affairs entirely eradicated from your mind all the remembrances of your private concerns? Or have you forgotten those vows of eternal friendship, which we have so often mutually exchanged? So it's just another demonstration that they really, truly were very close friends. And finally, he said, I haven't heard anything from you, but your friend, Dr. Knox, back on St. Croix, wrote to me and let me know that you have now been made aide-de-camp. You may be certain I received those accounts with the most unfeigned pleasure, especially as I was perfectly convinced that they were the rewards of essential services. And there's another really great letter from Stevens to Hamilton in 1778, so a year later after this one, written in French to Hamilton, And he basically, the whole letter was fretting about Hamilton's health, saying, you know, you were always so sickly as a child. I don't know how you're surviving these winter campaigns in North America. It must be because you're under the protection of George Washington. What a great guy. What a great leader. Really fascinating. And he concluded it saying, I'm writing to you in French since you speak it perfectly and I need to practice it a little bit. And that'll come in handy later on, as I mentioned. So after the Revolutionary War, as many of us know, Alexander Hamilton left active service after the Battle of Yorktown to study law. And of course, I could list many other things, but we'll just skip ahead to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where he served as a delegate. He was appointed the first Secretary of the Treasury in 1789. And in 1790, he moves to Philadelphia when the city becomes the nation's capital. So this is a condensed list, but it shows that the war did just what Hamilton thought it would do. It propelled him in life. It helped him reach a higher station. In fact, one of the highest he could achieve. He was the first Secretary of Treasury of a brand new country. So what about Edward Stevens? Well, he continued to remain in Scotland to work as a doctor. And in 1783, he moved back to St. Croix. And there's a letter from the same Dr. Knox that was friends with Hamilton, writing to him saying that the doctor has an extensive and lucrative practice and is much and deservedly esteemed in his profession. So he's already well established there. He spends 10 years on St. Croix and then he moves to Philadelphia. So once again, they're reunited. And just in time, because Edward Stevens saves Alexander Hamilton's life. So in 1793, there was a terrible yellow fever epidemic. 10% of the entire population of Philadelphia died. It was the nation's capital at the time. You had a lot of politicians. And both Alexander and his wife Eliza contracted the yellow fever. And luckily, Edward Stevens had just moved to the city, and he had had a lot of experience not only with yellow fever outbreaks in Edinburgh, but then in St. Croix, it's also very prevalent, the disease. And so he came with a new treatment. And Hamilton was so impressed by this treatment that was different than the main one that was being used that he writes a letter to the College of Physicians of Philadelphia saying that he had the yellow fever, but he trusts that I am now completely out of danger. This I am to attribute, under God, to the skill and care of my friend Dr. Stevens. So remember, he had just moved a few months prior to Philadelphia, wasn't well known, and so Hamilton wanted to make sure that he could get a reputation and be available to other clients and maybe use his methods. His mode of treating the disorder varies essentially from that which has been generally practiced. Now, the main form of treating yellow fever, Dr. Benjamin Rush was the most preeminent physician in Philadelphia. He wrote a whole pamphlet on it, but he favored bleeding, purging, vomiting, very violent to the system for yellow fever, whereas Edward Stevens treated the symptoms. So if a patient had fever, he treated the fever and so on. And that is today what the standard medical advice is. So Edward Stevens really was effective, but because Hamilton was such a prominent Federalist at the time, and Dr. Benjamin Rush was such a prominent Democratic Republican and friend of Thomas Jefferson, this in fact turned into a political battle over which treatment would you use. And you'd have the Federalists following Edward Stevens' treatment and vice versa. So really fascinating, but the important thing is that Stevens was able to save both Hamilton and his wife. Now in 1794, Edward Stevens is named as a lecturer back at King's College, which was now Columbia University. And Alexander Hamilton had helped reopen the college after the war, and he served as a trustee of Columbia, including during this time, all the way through his death. And Edward Stevens was named the professor of the practice of medicine at Columbia. So again, continuing that Columbia tradition. And just to take it full circle, we're going to end back in the Caribbean. So Hamilton and Stevens and Haiti. This is very fascinating, and not many people know. So the Haitian Revolution, it originally starts as a slave revolt that breaks out in 1791, and then through many different iterations, Toussaint Louverture, who is pictured here, takes over, and he is able to defeat the British that are trying to take over the island, and he becomes a leader there. And Hamilton had been involved. He was instrumental in the naming of nearly every U.S. consul to what it was called at the time, San Domingo, starting with the first one, Sylvius Bourne, appointed in 1790. And in 1799, Hamilton proposed Edward Stevens as U.S. Consul General to Haiti. Now, what's really important about this is that it was essentially seen as a recognition of Toussaint Louverture's government. So he had been the person in power and taking over and fighting, and by sending Edward Stevens with full diplomatic powers as a representative of the U.S., it was a very bold statement, one that Hamilton approved of, and it was the first republic led by former enslaved people. And so Edward Stevens serves as the Consul General from 1799 to 1801, and Timothy Pickering, if you remember, I mentioned him earlier, saying about the similarity between Edward Stevens and Alexander Hamilton. He said at the time he was Secretary of State, so he was in charge of approving Stevens, and he commented that Edward Stevens appears in all respects, singularly qualified for office. So he spoke French, practiced it with Hamilton, was from the Caribbean, had spent many years there, also was familiar with the US politics, had been living there, so he really was the perfect person to send over. Now, this is interesting. Alexander Hamilton drafts the Haitian Constitution. So Timothy Pickering had repeatedly asked, once they knew that Edward Stevens would be going down to Haiti, asked Hamilton to draft a constitutional plan so that it could be brought down to Toussaint. To what we advise, Toussaint will listen. So Hamilton sent his draft on February 21st, 1799, and it went down with Stevens. And his draft became the core of the Constitution proclaimed by Toussaint in 1801. So they started in the Caribbean together, and they ended it. I just want to make a special thank you note to Michael E. Newton. He'd done a lot of research on the early life of Edward Stevens and Hamilton on St. Croix, and he has a great book here at the bookstore, as well as a blog where he shares a lot of discoveries. And one of these discoveries I thought would be really interesting to close on, because it takes us even more full circle. He recently discovered that Edward Stevens served as president of St. Croix. This was not previously known. He discovered this document, and during the Napoleonic Wars, Great Britain had occupied St. Croix. St. Croix was owned by Denmark. It was a Danish island. And so Great Britain occupied it twice. And Edward Stevens was selected by the British. They knew him, they liked him, they respected him, and they had him serve as president, a position that hadn't previously existed on St. Croix. So he was president for about 2.5 months, and there's a letter signed by him at the bottom, Edward Stevens, president. So there's so many fascinating things to discover, and I hope that you enjoyed the presentation, enjoyed seeing where Hamilton came from, where he ended up, and how his friend was along with him for the ride. Thank you so much. Any questions? Yes. So Toussaint Louverture, I can give a whole nother presentation on the Haitian Revolution, but he basically was at the forefront leader of this movement. He was leading the military forces to defeat the British, and there was a lot of political infighting, but he did proclaim himself as essentially the leader of Haiti within that time period. Yes. Any other questions? Yes. They had different terms at the time. You would see minister plenipotentiary, and so I think consul general there was still the debate over was it still part of France, because it hadn't actually received its independence. It didn't receive it until 1804 on paper from France, so it was technically still a part. So that's why I think in that case it was consul instead of, and that was a big heating point. I mean, at the time the U.S. was at war with France. This was in the middle of the Quasi-War, which Hamilton was also the major general overseeing all of the military buildup. Going back to I wish there was a war. But he really wanted to support Haiti, unlike other leaders that maybe were on the plantations that were very afraid that a slave revolt could lead to a free republic that did not like that precedent set. Hamilton was very much in favor, and he wanted to do what the U.S. could to recognize Haiti as a republic, even though France hadn't officially granted its independence. Yes?
How often would Hamilton then go to Haiti, or did he?
So Hamilton never went to Haiti. It was just, he proposed a written form of, I think this will work there. And he has a really interesting quote saying that every constitution has to be fit to the country or to the area. And so he tailor-made, he said, this wouldn't work other places, and what we have here wouldn't work other places, but this is what I think would work for now, and including naming Toussaint as the president or the leader for life, which Toussaint obviously used. Yes? It would have taken about, on average, I would say 3 weeks or so to get between. Keep in mind, St. Croix was a very important island. It had a free port. There was a huge mercantile exchange, especially between New York and the island. So they were constantly captains going back and forth. In fact, earlier in the letter, I edited that part out, but he talks about the captains on the ships that had brought him Stephen's letters. So there was definitely a very strong communication between the island and especially New York City. So going back to, and I didn't get to spend a lot of time on it, but so I'm glad you brought it up, of Hamilton commenting that I would risk my life, though not my character, to improve himself. So I think when you think of character in the 18th century term, he was very consistent to what that meant. And so character was hand in hand with that concept of honor and reputation that was a little hard for 21st century U.S. Citizens to look back and understand exactly what it meant at the time. But you see that where he's not willing to go for example, he could have easily engaged in stock trading and gotten very rich. He did not do that because he wanted his system to be perfect and to be respected. So he sold any stock that he had so that he wouldn't be accused of speculation. When he served in Congress as a congressman, he was fighting for the rights of veterans to get pensions, which the government had not paid up on. So he, in his good conscience, felt that he couldn't fight for these pensions for military soldiers if he himself was a military soldier. So he denounced receiving any pension ever so that he could be considered in the clear to fight for the pension of all these soldiers, which he did. And that was really difficult for, after Hamilton died, that Eliza didn't have that pension, and she fought decades later to finally receive that, and it took a long time to get that recognized. So and you can see example after example of and so many people commented, all these people around him get rich, he could easily be rich, but he cared more that his systems were respected, that his honor was intact. And so from an 18th century standpoint, he was very consistent in that and willing to risk his life. Many times he almost died in battle, but he would not risk his character. So thank you. Yes. So he actually, what is his connection with the Coast Guard? He founded what today we call the Coast Guard. I have a whole nother talk on that. But as Secretary of the Treasury, he proposed formulated and planned and oversaw the entire creation of what was the Revenue Marine, or also the Cutter Service. So it was a series of 10 ships that later grew to more. And he was also responsible for lighthouses and many other functions that now today live under the umbrella of the Coast Guard. So he's considered today as the father of the U.S. Coast Guard. Yes?
Actually have a condensed version of your talk on the Hamilton Grange page.
Yes, so you can either go to the Hamilton Grange page or also my website. You can go NicoleScholet.com, and I have a whole talk on that.
Foremost Hamilton expert, right? In front of our very eyes.
I do specialize in topics that no one else has really taken an in-depth look at, including the Coast Guard. It was amazing. I started this research maybe about 7 years ago on him and the Coast Guard, and there really was nothing existing, and still isn't, on what he did. It was known he was the father of the Coast Guard, but it was just very vague. And so I went in depth and saw not only his ideas for it, what he did to propose it to Congress, and then what he did to see it out. So from idea to implementation, it was all him. Yes? That's an interesting question. So did he actively pursue being named as Secretary of the Treasury? There's an interesting story that George Washington, when he was setting up his cabinet and choosing his ministers, he went to, of course now I'm blanking, Robert Morris, thank you, to Robert Morris. And Robert Morris, who today is known as the financier of the Revolution, he did so much to keep us financially afloat. He turned Washington down and said, I think you should ask Hamilton. Hamilton had worked briefly under Morris as a New York commissioner for the state of for taxes, and he had written Morris a lot of letters of his thoughts on financial systems. And so Washington supposedly said, Hamilton, he had no idea that Hamilton had so much knowledge in the financial sector. He knew him as a military man, knew him as a lawyer, as a pamphleteer, but not as a financial person. And so then Washington went and asked Hamilton. So I don't believe Hamilton actively sought it. I'm sure he wanted an active position.
His background in St. Croix when he worked for the Mercantile.
Absolutely. So, I mean, he did have a very strong interest in finance, not only from serving as a clerk and having to understand so many different currencies and trade, which gave him a different perspective than all the other founding fathers. But even when he was in the Revolutionary War, he would lug around Postlewaite's, you know, all these books that I've seen them in person. They are this big by this big by this big. They are massive, and he would carry them around with him during the Revolutionary War to read and study, and on the back of his work for Washington or payroll journals, he would take notes. So he was always very interested in it. He was one of the co-founders of the Bank of New York, which still exists today. So he did have a strong financial background, but I guess Washington wasn't as familiar with that. Yes? So a couple things I could share with you. One, that there's this great quote by, again, blanking on the name, but he was the Talleyrand, who was a major leader in France, and he remembered walking by his office really late at night and seeing the candle on and Hamilton scribbling at his desk while he was Secretary of Treasury and saying, by God, this man is working at all hours of the night preserving the finances of the country while he himself is, you know, poor. Obviously he wasn't poor, but so that was a big thing. And then also he did write a full schedule for his son when he went to school of how he thought his son should follow his schedule, which is pretty common. John Adams also did that for his son. But it is interesting to see you will study between these hours, and then, you know, after 9 o'clock you can have some free time in on Sundays, you know. So he was very busy, always active. I mean, it can't even list all the things he did, and yet that was his actual life, the societies he was involved with, the things he founded. I mean, to write the Haitian Constitution, you know, the basis of it, it's all these little factoids when you dive deep into what he did. And so it's interesting to bring more of those to light that maybe don't reach the normal narrative about Hamilton. Any last questions? Well, thank you so much for being here today. And at 2 o'clock, there's the open house upstairs. I'll be around to answer any more questions, either down here or up there. Thank you so much for supporting the AHA Society's Happy Birthday Hamilton, and hope to see you again at a future event. Thank you.